Okay, due to some texts I got, I'm going to keep reading. So this is part two. I'm not going to do the introduction. I will just read the last paragraph from the last one and then I will go from there. So this is part two of the reading. Sunlight would kill us by literally cooking us from the inside out. The remains did reduce to ash rather quickly, but it was not an instantaneous event. It was a much slower and painful process, and yes, we could feel pain. We had nerve endings and a brain to register the sensation, so why wouldn't we? Now, we have a higher tolerance for it. That one I can't explain, except maybe if you know you're going to heal, the pain seems less important. We came to a halt in front of one of the guest suite doors. Anders stepped up and knocked. I clasped my hands in front of me, squared my shoulders, and waited solemnly. When the door opened, a maid's head appeared, complete with the odd black and white frilled cap on top of her short brown hair. It was styled to look random and slightly tossed, but I'm sure she had to spend a considerable amount of time getting it that way. She was several inches shorter than I was, and her hazel eyes widened when she saw me. The door opened completely, and her smile widened with it. "Miss Allison will be delighted," the woman began, and then her scent hit me like a slap in the face. It was the smell of warm blood being pumped through living veins, with a hint of something metallic. I closed my eyes and inhaled her aroma slowly. Realization hit me and I gasped, cupping a hand over my mouth and nose. The maid was human. I backpedaled fast, Andrew and Michael quickly stepping in front of me. Just then, another young woman appeared at the door. This one was obviously Allison. She had blonde hair that was cut stylishly short, tossed with soft waves that looked both trendy and classy at the same time. Her jeans were expensive, and her cashmere top was cut just a bit too low. Michael glared at her. "We were not told you had a pet with you," he hissed. Allison let her blue eyes go wide. "I am so sorry. I had no idea that I should have mentioned it," she gasped, and quickly shooed the maid back into the room. I had flattened myself against the other wall, one hand still cupped over my mouth and nose to try to stifle the smell. It was sweet and warm and made my mouth water, even though the reaction disgusted me at the same time. Her heartbeat was slower than an untouched human's, stunted by the vampire venom that now tainted her blood. I shook my head to try to clear it, and Allison took a step towards me. "I am so sorry, Reina. I had no idea you were. I never would have brought her." I pulled my hand away and flinched. "I'm fine. I just wasn't prepared," I said quietly, my teeth trying not to clench. I could still hear her heart beating, now that I knew it was there. My skin twitched and my eyes were glued to that doorway. Some vampires fed the old-fashioned way, from living humans. Pets, as we called them, were a safe alternative to hunting. The humans that were willing to tilt their neck to feed their owners for the hopes of that final bite that would offer them eternal life. It didn't matter that vampires weren't really immortal. We aged slow enough for it to seem that way. Unfortunately, very few pets were ever turned, and most simply finished their lives without the immortal ending they'd hoped for. My dad and I, along with a growing number of vampires, detested the practice. We fed off what we called store blood. It was cloned, bagged, and delivered without the death of any donors. Since it didn't come from a nice warm body, it had to be kept at a very precise temperature, or it can make us sick for several days. But it was civilized and ethical. Having a human pet was a tradition that had fallen to the wayside by nearly all civilized vampires. But sadly, like with all fads, it had become popular with the younger generation again. Michael turned to me, the concern on his face and in his eyes. Like me, he didn't feed on humans and felt the same way about those that considered it chic. Ander had been human once, unlike Michael and me, so his distaste for the practice went even deeper than ours. His jaw square His square jaw was tight and his eyes peered at the girl. She flinched under the visual attack. I'll send her off immediately. Her eyes were wide, her hands were clasped to her chest, with a look of sheer panic on her pretty face. I turned and started down the hall, one hand on the wall, the other on my stomach. Please, Reina, I am so sorry, she pleaded as she ran up to me. I had no idea bringing her would be such a big deal. She winced even as the words came out of her mouth. It is a big deal, I hissed, without looking at her. I can't believe you practice that. I couldn't even finish the statement. She moved in front of me, trying to look into my face. Reina, please, I am so sorry. You don't know how sorry I am. I growled and nodded. Get her, out of here. I won't have that going on under my roof. Another man ran down the hallway and then slowed to a walk. He looked at me and I locked my eyes on his. He nodded as he stepped up to me and I felt my thoughts start to regroup. Ignoring Allison's stare, the man leaned into my ear and started to whisper, too low for the others to hear. He was a werewolf. The wolf side of me was calmed by his words, his smell, and his touch. That helped the rest of me calm. Finally, I stood up taller, nodding, and whispered a thank you. He smiled at me, shot her a hard look, nodded to my guards, and turned back down the way he had come. When I tried to walk, Allison stepped in front of me. I wanted us to be friends, and now I've ruined any chance of that happening. Her face was sad, and I saw the same emotion in her eyes. No matter the race, people had a harder time lying with their eyes. I sighed. Regardless of her spoiled upbringing, she was the daughter of my father's friends. We Beldrons had a very public image, and I suddenly had visions of her whispering about this to her tea-top friends. Better to make amends now. You didn't know, I stated, trying to find a diplomatic tone. Get her out of here, and we'll forget it happened. Her head bobbed almost comically. Absolutely, immediately. When she didn't turn and run to take care of it, I frowned. We stood there in the hallway, an awkward silence between us. Would you like a tour of the manor? I finally groaned, sure she would decline after what just happened. I would love it, she smiled, nearly bouncing on her toes. Let me just take care of things, and I'll meet you in a few minutes. Ugh, great. I'll be in my sitting room. You can meet me there. She nodded again with her blonde hair bouncing, and when she still didn't move, I turned and walked off. Bringing a pet in here, I hissed as we headed towards the stairs. How'd she even get it in here? Exactly what I intend to find out, Ander hissed quietly. I had barely reached my private sitting room when Allison rushed in. I looked down, seeing her stylish high heels under her trendy, expensive jeans. That was something else I never understood. I love jeans, don't get me wrong. I lived in them when I could. But to pair them with a mini pair of stilts definitely limited the things you could do, even with a vampire's reflexes and stealth. Allison was smiling and went to apologize again, but a hard look from me made it quite clear that we were going to act like it hadn't happened at all. She nodded and instead glanced around the room. This was my private living room, so it was filled with all the things that I liked. There was a huge flat-screen TV mounted on one wall. An oversized leather couch sat across from it, with two large plush recliners at each end. They were expensive because of my dad, but they were deliciously comfortable because of me. This was one of my favorite rooms. Allison's eyes ran across to the other wall. There was a desk with my laptop, which was half buried in papers, and even had a t-shirt thrown over the top. I was no computer expert, but I did go online for various reasons. She stepped up to my stereo system and then moved to my treadmill. She put her hand on the control panel and looked at me with a confused expression. "I like to run," I said flatly. Due to our unique diet, we didn't gain excess weight. We were naturally strong, and normal exercise was not something we needed. For me, on the other hand, running was a necessity at times. "Is it because you're part, she asked, trying to appear humble about it. I sighed despite myself and nodded. I was different from most vampires, though not as unique as some. My mother was half werewolf, so I was 1/4 werewolf and 3/4 vampire. It made for an odd mix, but I didn't have the problems that my mother did, problems that eventually killed her shortly after I was born. I couldn't shapeshift, hybrids rarely could, but my body did ache to run at times. It wasn't brought on by the call of a full moon either, which was another human-made myth. My werewolf pack did run every full moon, but it was more as a symbolic snub at the humans that created all the obscene stories of our kinds. Every werewolf's internal need to change was different. Most males couldn't go more than a few weeks without it. Females, however, didn't shift very often. For me, the urge came as a burning in my muscles, followed by the complete inability to think clearly. My senses became exaggerated, and I would get, well, let's just say very irritable, and leave it at that. When I couldn't run outside, I ran here. My dad did have to have it modified to handle my speed, though, which was considerable. As I said, I'm not overly common, but not unique in the world of vampires either. There were those with even stranger mixes, and some so mutated by extreme mixing that the council had a group dedicated solely to hunting them and putting them down. We called them sparks, because once these hybrids snaps, destruction follows. It didn't happen much anymore, since the minor races have all but disappeared. It used to be a big problem, and a lot of the humans' boogeyman type stories came from a not so pleasant encounter with one. Most of us non-humans liked our solitude. While we lived our lives in the same world as humans, we were so completely separate at the same time. Werewolves could blend in more than we could, though there were vampires that did move among the humans, mostly for business reasons these days. As for other races, I know very little about them. Because of my condition, and also due to my father's rank and protectiveness, I led a rather sheltered life. "Do you, change?" Allison whispered, looking at Michael and Ander as if this were something my personal bodyguards wouldn't know about me. I guess she knew as much about hybrids as she did about guards. "No," I stated, and moved over to the wall next to the TV. With a push of a button, a panel slid to the side, exposing dozens of shelves filled with movies. I pretended to be looking through them, hoping she was done with her "what else do freaky hybrids do?" questions. She smiled and walked up to me. "I heard that Jonathan is coming tomorrow. Anton Hilver's son." I shrugged, still glancing at the movies. "I can't believe I'm going to meet him in person," she squealed, and I swear she actually bounced on her toes, in those shoes. Then she gasped, I hope I'll get to meet him." Her eyes locked on mine, and I would have sworn she was trying to work vampire's persuasion on me, except for one thing. It didn't work on other vampires. Allison was younger than me, regardless of the fact that we both looked like we were about 18. Another part of having both vampire and werewolf blood in my veins, I aged differently than both races. Werewolves age slowly, although not as slow as vampires. Most live just over 500 years. So the DNA that caused their slow aging, mixed with the vampire genes, made my life expectancy as a vampire less than it normally would be. No one knew by how long, but my father had decided that since I was three-fourths vampire, it would be so minimal it wouldn't matter. I figured that was a father's hope talking, but I liked that theory, so I stayed with it. I've heard that Jonathan is absolutely gorgeous, she chirped. He runs some of the clubs here in the States and is expected to be called to serve on the High Blood Council as well, she stated, reminding me of the humans I saw on TV drooling over their movie stars. I eyed her as my hopes of us ever being friends slipped further away. We were polar opposites in too many ways for that to be a possibility. She was excitable, trendy, and cared too much about those kind of things. I shivered as I pictured her out at our main gate, screaming and waving as this Jonathan character drove through in a dark glassed limo. I turned towards the large picture window of my third-story retreat and felt the pull from the other side of the hidden tree line. "Track, where are you?" I growled mentally. "Is your father trying to hook you up with Jonathan?" she asked quietly, even biting her lower lip a bit. "Probably," I replied, the annoyance all too obvious on my face. She nodded, not put off by my rudeness at all. "It would be a very good match." This time I noticed she was looking at her shoes when she said it. I opened my mouth to tell her that, no matter what my father's intention might be, I wouldn't be matched with this club-owning vampire. But I closed it. What was the point? She was trying to be nice, and it wasn't her fault I was so moody. "I'll make sure you get to meet him," I said instead, and that put the sparkle back into her blue eyes. She returned to her chipper self and was rambling on about the latest fashions and even planning shopping trips for us when I smiled and looked towards the door. Ander and Michael turned, and Allison stopped, noticing our attention had been pulled away. Then my best friend walked in. Track was 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders, dark brown hair that had that "I just got out of bed, but this look has become very sexy" look. His eyes were light brown and almost seemed to glow in the moonlight, or when the lights hit inside just the right way. Tonight he was dressed in well-worn jeans that fit his muscular figure nicely. The black t-shirt added to the rough, bad boy look that he liked to portray. He nodded to Michael and Ander, who did the same. They didn't like Track as much as I did. It was mostly because they couldn't go with me when I went into pack territory. Not because they weren't allowed, per se, but my father had declared the protection there to be more than adequate. Any less would have been an insult to the pack. I knew Allison could smell what he was. Even the weakest vampire's nose could tell a werewolf. So I just smiled and introduced them, then watched Allison for her reaction. Vampires and werewolves weren't enemies. We worked together a lot. My father had a dozen werewolves that worked the day shift here to watch over things while we slept. But vampires as a whole rarely mingled with others. Like I said, pompous and arrogant. Allison looked him over thoroughly. She couldn't be more than 5'5", though she stood as tall as me with those heels on. Her nose twitched a bit as she took in his scent, and Track winked at me as we waited through the seconds it took her. I grinned at him and mouthed a silent "You're late." He winked and flashed his award-winning smile that got him out of trouble more than once. I actually loved being part werewolf, especially being part of a pack. It was the one my mother came from, and the same one Track was raised in. They lived just on the other side of that tree line, on land my father had purchased and given to them. He gave it to them to help with the peace when he fell in love with my mother. Track and I didn't share the same blood. His father came into the pack before he was born and took a mate from outside their pack as well. but he was mentally and emotionally connected to them all, and as loyal to them as any. He was also my best friend. Allison smiled. "Hello, Track. It's very nice to meet you." "Same here," he stated quickly, and then turned to me. I groaned. "My dad has guests. They're going to be here for a while, and he's trying to play matchmaker. Again." That about summed it up. Track's brows furrowed, and I nodded, rolling my eyes. "His name is Jonathan Hilver, and he's supposed to be here tomorrow." Track walked over and plopped down in one of the chairs, sitting sideways with one leg over the arm. I knew he was hamming up the rough boy attitude for my guest. I rolled my eyes, then looked to Allison. She, however, was grinning ear to ear, and hurried over to the couch, sitting on the end closest to his chair. I tilted my head and grinned. This might prove amusing after all. "Jonathan Hilver," Track stated. "Well, tomorrow we're supposed to initiate 2 new wolves, so unless he comes early, he'll just have to wait to meet you." "Initiate new wolves?" Allison gasped. "Oh, that must be amazing to watch." She stated, her eyes fixated on Track, and her hunger for an invitation more than obvious. He nodded and sat up and leaned towards her. "It can be a bit messy, though, if you know what I mean." He winked at the girl, and my brows rose as she actually giggled. I left them high on my forehead when I looked at Track, and he shrugged, his gesture telling me I could bring her along if I wanted to. My frown told him I didn't. Our ability to hold nearly full conversations via facial expression and body language was partly due to being pack, and partly from being best friends that spent a lot of time together. "Reina and I are planning a shopping trip," Allison stated, still engrossed in the werewolf sitting in the leather chair. "Do you have any malls around here that stay open late enough?" Track's smile dipped a bit, and he shook his head. "Reina doesn't go to the malls." The blonde head turned and looked at me. I shrugged. "Me and human crowds don't work out so well." "Oh, well, how do you—" "There are shops here that are run by vampires, and I also do a lot of online shopping." Wow, was I as pathetic as that just sounded? "I see," she stated, with far too much pity in her voice for my liking. I frowned. That was another downfall to the mix in my blood. While werewolves didn't eat people as a general rule, their hunger for the hunt was still embedded in my DNA, even if distantly. If I got around humans too close to my irritable stage, I had some problems focusing. If one of them ran past me or even moved too fast, well, the last time Track and a few other pack wolves had to tackle me and literally carry me out to keep me from attacking. Not a pretty picture. My father's position wasn't the only reason that this manner was the boundaries of my world most of the time. Track was helping me to try to control it, as were some of the others in the pack, like Manny that came to my rescue earlier. I was getting better, but a mall packed with humans was just asking for trouble. "She's working hard to get control of it, though," Track stated, trying to come to my defense. "She's actually doing a lot better." There was a bit of pack pride in his voice, but I moaned. To Allison, that was just more pity fodder. He seemed to realize it and lowered his eyes as a submissive apology to me. I winced, since that reaction made me want to go curl up in the massive chair with him and let him know it was okay, that I understood he was being protective, and that I appreciated it. I looked at Allison and hid a smile as I imagined what her reaction would be to that. Track and I cuddled a lot. Being pack meant we needed to be close to each other when we could. It was another thing that Ander and Michael didn't like, and another reason that having a vampire boyfriend wouldn't work out so well. I grinned at Track, and he looked up, also realizing I couldn't come to him. He gave a small nod and slapped one of his legs. Well then, how about I raid the fridge and look for something to put in my mouth to keep it busy? He flashed his smile at me as he jumped up. Allison watched with mounting curiosity as he walked over to a small door near my treadmill. He opened it and looked through the contents. I kept it stocked for his visits, and I even tried my hand at making things for him. He was always trying to do things for me, and I liked seeing the look on his face when I made something he actually liked. My father had a full kitchen installed, with top-of-the-line appliances, just to amuse my culinary hobby. And I am going to stop there. Hope you enjoyed.